Hi, and welcome to the Silo Solving Podcast. I am your host, Danelle Marqui Brown. You can call me Day for short. And I'm very excited to welcome you to another episode where we're pairing yet another unique pairing of professionals from different walks of life and knowledge expertise. And we're going to really dig into a very important topic and discussion that affects pretty much all of us, like regardless of where we are and what walk of life we come from. So I'm going to dive in and introduce you to today's guest. I'm going to have to look down and read my notes because they're this incredible beings and are working in so many different intersectional areas that help when it comes to focusing with sustainability and behavior change. To introduce you to our first guest, we have Michelle Benavides. She is the executive director of the International Society of Sustainability Professionals. For short, it's ISP, which I will use throughout this conversation. So as a successful business leader, international trainer, a strategic community builder, she brings accessibility to often the technical field and paves the way for every individual to engage in the mission of sustainability. She is a lead accredited professional in the building design and construction, high performance building sector. And she's also an educator and a U.S. Green Buildings Council faculty member and a Fitwell ambassador. And additionally, Michelle has trained more than 2,000 professionals worldwide by delivering on-demand courses and in-person sessions before joining the organization. So welcome to the podcast, Michelle. I'm very excited to have you.
Thank you, Danelle. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. And next, we have Dr. Anne-Christiane Duhaime, and she is the author of Minding the Climate, How Neuroscience Can Solve Our Environmental Crisis. She is a senior pediatric neurosurgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital. She is the associate director of the Center for Environment and Health at Harvard. In addition, she is the Nicholas T. Zervas Professor of Neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School and faculty associate of the Harvard University Center for Environment. So thank you, Doctor, for joining, Dr. Duhaime, for joining the Silo Solving podcast.
Thanks, Day. Great to be here.
Thank you. So the reason why the theme, a big theme throughout this podcast series is to bring different people together to think outside the box so that way we can collaborate for innovative and nuanced thinking for problems that many of us face. And so the big problem that the world is facing is climate change. That's just like you connect many dots and it leads back to climate change being a big issue. But then there's also the notion of, so we just started a new year and it's 2023, which means that we're 7 years away from 2030, which is a big, important milestone date where not only is that set forth for the Paris Climate Agreement, but it's also for the Sustainable Development Goals by meeting those 17 goals by 2030. So to help us, and when I'm saying us, I mean the world, the part of having this conversation is to introduce it and share it with the audience worldwide who tune in. I wanted to talk about SDGs by 2030 because time is ticking. So I also, to this for context for our audience, I wanted to say that both Michelle and Dr. Duhaime had never met each other before this silo solving conversation. So we're all co-creating this dialogue together, and we have different means of knowing each other. So over the course of this conversation, we'll learn more about each other and see how we can problem solve. So to jump into this process, I'm came up with this term called a silo breaker. It's a play on an icebreaker as a way for primarily our guests to start to know each other and to begin the flow of the dialogue and to model creative brainstorming. So I figured a good way to do that is, pardon my, as you can see, I have a lot of notes throughout, but I had to there was one particular phrase, or there was many passages in this great book by Dr. Duhaime, Minding the Climate. But I wanted to read a particular passage from the book. And then after I finish doing that, I'm going to ask you both from the perspective of your professional background, if you can speak to that passage, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to read. So I'm paraphrasing here when it's saying it's a paragraph talking about the nature of the climate change challenge that we're facing. So it reads, this challenge requires change at the individual household level, at the political level, through social movements, and through major overhauls of the institutions and economic structures and incentives around the globe. Leaders and policymakers who can envision the long-range, insurance experts who projections nudge the business needle, investors looking for the next big thing, medical professionals rallying us around our own short-term health interests and concerns for our families, international reporters who can connect the dots between famine and war and migration and can appeal to our altruism and the promise of hope for a better outcome, all will play a role. The lure of a less damaged environment will provide a weightier reward to more people based on these influences. Others may respond to shiny new technology that appeals. Honeybee rewards colleagues who try new ways and like them. So since you wrote the book, Doctor, can you, whatever comes to mind from this hearing that passage again, can you speak on what comes up for you when you recall that?
Thanks, Dave. That's a summary of the complexity that this problem poses, and that the solutions are not easy, nor are they, as you've pointed out, at any single level. So people have looked at the title of the book and the subtitle and focused on individual behavior. The idea being that if I'm talking about the brain and how the brain evolved to make decisions and how that evolution may not serve us well in this particular brand new problem for us as a species, they think that it's only about behavior at the individual level. So what that paragraph is trying to point out is that while I believe it's true that decisions and changes in behavior are processed through the brain of the individual, the scale at which individual people operate is not just at the sphere of the behavior that affects your individual personal life. It's also at the sphere where you behave as the leader of a company, as a mid-level manager in a business, as an educator who has influence over many people, as a podcaster or a writer or an orator who may reach many people at once. Your mind has to be changed first, or at least your needle tipped. And then your influence may be well beyond what you choose to do in terms of what kind of car you buy or whatever. Your influence may be much bigger than just your personal life. So that paragraph is my way of cataloging the scale at which each of us functions in different capacities to make this change at multiple levels.
Thank you for that. And Michelle, how does that come up for you?
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree more. I mean, it really is, as an organization, ISSP really functions by supporting the individual professionals at the head of the work that Dr. Duhaime lists out, from all aspects of society, pushing forward these SDGs. And at the core of that is, how can we help each individual multiply their effect? And whether that's working on things like, within the ESG sector and reporting and looking at the business and the economics, whether that's a medical professional solving how they can help the community understand the importance of understanding how heat is affecting their health on a daily basis. There's been a lot of research that's been coming out around that connection, looking at how each individual really can both amplify their voice, their work, their passion about where we need to be as a society, and then how they can come together across nations, across communities, across households sometimes, in order to really push forward towards this very critical deadline that's coming at us fast.
And given that ISSP, it covers the spectrum of work professionals, but it's also just from what you were saying, there's like an intergenerational component from the standpoint of education. And so, Dr. Duhaime, in your book, in your work as a neurosurgeon, working specializing in working with children, can you speak to just a little bit about the spectrum of age and how brain development affects that? Just because all of us, regardless of our age, are situated in this issue of climate, but yet we are all probably going to experience it differently because of our brain. So
great point, Day, and it's one that people don't talk about very much. So I'm glad you asked the question. So I'm fascinated by what Michelle is saying, because it touches on many of the things in the book about what is rewarding to human beings, and then we'll get to the age question. You won't make a decision to change behavior unless your brain uses its mechanism, which it does involuntarily, to weigh the pros and cons of that decision, much of which happens subconsciously. And ultimately, the decision is weighed by that choice, which your brain calculates as most rewarding. And here we're using rewarding not like, candy bar, like, oh, it's great this second. But the reward in the brain that we're talking about is when you weigh together all the different factors, ultimately the brain gives a go to this particular behavioral choice and decision. And the thing that I find so interesting, Michelle, about what you're saying is that what you're doing is one of the main behavior change strategies, which is you're substituting social reward. You're inculcating social reward. So whether it's cross-generational, cross-sector, cross-organization, when you find like-minded people, it accelerates and amplifies your own decision. And so whether it's across generations, to get back to your question, Day, or whether it's in other ways, connecting with other people is a powerful reward and a powerful both motivator and, as you said, amplifier of a choice you've made about the importance of this topic. So that's what works, is substituting social reward for things you may be giving up, like convenience or a resistance to change because it's something new and scary and I don't get how it works or whatever. So, Day, to get back to your question about brain development, there's plenty of data that show, and we know this from our personal experience, that when you are young, and particularly when you don't have much responsibility to anybody but yourself, you can get very, very invested in a particular topic and a particular cause. History is full of how young people have taken on causes. When you get older and now you're responsible for, your employees, your immediate family, your parents and their well-being, people tend to get more conservative, and they tend to broaden their choices and the considerations that they bring to decision making. And a lot of that is because now they're responsible for other people. And this is why oftentimes business leaders they're, answering to their shareholders, they're answering to their boards. And so the financial considerations take on greater importance. Whereas the younger people, they're about, I want to live in this future. And so they can be very effective as a voice because their responsibilities are not so diluted. And therefore, I think the approach of reaching across generations can tap into that monofocus, which is ethically and morally and intellectually valid. And it can give people at the other end of the spectrum who have multiple considerations in their decision-making some additional energy.
Yeah, I mean, I see that play out all the way down to my 5-year-old who cut and dry cannot handle when she sees litter. She's offended and deeply, deeply upset about anyone who would dare to do things like this. It all connects. I agree. That's why the youth is so critical to this movement, because at the end of the day, they are going to be living, far longer ultimately in the reality that we're creating. And it is fascinating to hear brain development wise and responsibility and how all of this plays out to really help shape this. But, at the same time, I think there are ways that we can really work together to harness some of that energy and use the exact responsibilities that often decision makers can sometimes hide behind, in order to really force their hand and really open their eyes to the importance overall of making these decisions for the better of our whole future, including some of these things with ESG and the reporting and how critical it is to share the real impact you're having. Well, a lot of that's come around because of the consumer voice and of the youth and of people starting to wake up to the fundamentals of sustainability and of where we're at as a world. A lot of that comes down to, we can help the decision makers who are looking at the shareholders and the responsibility to see the huge connection and the responsibility for the entire world that they're also holding. If we can keep pushing forward this education and uplifting these voices that really are leading us down the path we have to go.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So the name of the podcast series is called Silo Solving, and just for context the origins of silo comes from kind of like an agriculture, as a structure where they basically suck the air out so that way silage can be stored. But from that initial definition came this common notion used today of silos, particularly within offices and institutions and corporations, where there are these kind of social silos or silo thinking that create, that basically deflate communication and air pathways for communication collaboration. So hence the name silo solving is a play on problem solving for such communication and collaboration breakdowns. So I say that to say, so the last or SDG 17, the partnership for the goals is, from my perspective, they're all so important. That's part of the complexity of this problem of achieving these goals, but specifically the partnership and the collaboration component is so important for the various reasons that you both spoke to. And so because there's so many different problems and there's different teams, if you will, that kind of need to champion and we need to work together. So I wanted to raise this a question just to see what you both, just to see what comes up. Of those 17 SDGs, which range like some, it's like ending poverty, hunger, gender equality, infrastructure, there's across the board, it seems to me that there are some of the goals that we're trying to reach have more of a technical nature to them. Like, so if you built the technology to like clean energy, that's like a technical aspect. But then you have something like gender equality and inequality, which really goes into like the cultural behavioral aspects. So jump in first, but this to speak to this is there a way, do you think, to like approach the SDGs from those, what is the behavioral and what is the technical, just to help us really kind of get at the crux of the problem? Because, and this is just something that I'm just curious about, is like, if that's part of the reason why it's hard to meet these goals, is because of some of them being at the core behavioral and some of them more so being technical. And it's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg?
I'll take that on, because I think it raises a lot of questions, and I really have questions for Michelle. Because when I look at those goals, I work in a hospital, a large medical center, an academic medical center. And if I look at those 17 goals, what's my hospital going to say? Which ones are applicable? And they're going to look at number 3, good health and well-being, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Okay, so let's break that down. We're a healthcare institution. And so my leadership might say, well, we're working on that. We're doing cutting edge technology. We're doing gene therapy. We're doing, billions of dollars of medical research. So that's our lane. We're working on health. We're working on making people healthy. And then some of us might say, yeah, but the healthcare sector in the United States produces 10% of the greenhouse gases. So you should do that, but you should do it in a sustainable way. And you should do your increased health, improved health in a way that doesn't mess up those other goals. And you should do it in an equitable way, because your technology may be great, but what about, like you said, Day, what about in the global South, where there's also poverty, and who gets what? What about the allocation of resources? So when you talk about silos, the meeting I was in just before this podcast was with professionals that make technology that can help us potentially get data out of our huge biomedical research institute to see whether or not we can do our biomedical research more sustainably. But the people who are doing the biomedical research, where is their reward coming from? It's coming from, I'm curing cancer. I learned a new, gene that we can screen for, or find a solution to this genetic disease. And I'm focusing on that. And don't bother me with doing it more sustainably and cutting my carbon footprint by some molecule that's not going to make one bit of difference in the global picture. On the other hand, other people say, this is our problem, all of our problem. And we all have to do our part for carbon footprint and toxicity that we're polluting the world with. So to me, the silos are in part because the rewards we get for doing our job, our lane well, don't necessarily align with other parts of these siloed, you can say SDGs, but you can say financial incentives, or your primary role, the primary task that is under your jurisdiction, like curing cancer. So how do we get across those? And I'm going to throw that one at Michelle, because I don't know the answer. I know what we've tried, but I don't know the solution.
I am thrilled to hear that you see directly how important healthcare is across these SDGs, because ultimately you are correct. You are not just about at that specific facility, good health and well-being. Yes, that's critical. Yes, of course, that has to be number one focus. But at the end of the day, I mean, the hospital systems, the procurement that happens, and the responsible consumption and production that happens within those walls, and the greenhouse gas emissions that you mentioned, all of those things, hospital systems, healthcare systems are at the forefront of a lot of this, as are so many other industries. And it's really, really critical, again, that we have that fundamental understanding across the board. And that really comes back to how you open people's eyes and allow them to see their connections and how they best fit within this mission. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe has some incredible work around this and how to best communicate the climate crisis with those that feel that they are, everything in me is going towards fighting this cancer. thank goodness. I'm glad that professional is there at the cutting edge research. But at the end of the day, there are ways that we can communicate how important that professional's 100% of passion going towards that research will be affected by the climate crisis. Day, you mentioned that earlier on, that climate, we know from the research, is augmenting every other crisis out there. So coming back to that education piece of how can we begin to open people's eyes to how interconnected all of these SDGs are, these missions, these aspects that have been laid out in this beautiful, not perfect, but beautiful framework. It gives us that ladder and that interconnected dialogue to be able to say, hey, you may not see it as like, well, why should I worry about at this healthcare facility? Why should I be focusing on clean water? Or why, that may have health implications, but why should I be focusing on that very small carbon footprint, or, what I can do as an individual? Well, because ultimately the work you're doing is strongly affected by the rest of this footprint and by the rest of these SDGs, whether or not you may see it. And that's our job as sustainability professionals, is to open everyone's eyes to be able to see the economic impacts, to be able to see the health impacts, obviously, the education impacts, the gender equality impacts, the social justice impacts that come all together and are all compounding upon each other. And then to start bringing together, really, to break down these silos, bringing together the partners and the organizations and the sectors out there that are very in their lane, doing incredible work in one direction, and helping them to have those conversations and see how interconnected so much of this is, so that we can amplify and bring forward even faster change across the board. Unfortunately, when you talk about silos, they're within sustainability alone, within the work in these SDGs, way too much happening on completely separate planes. You look specifically like at the green building sector, for example, incredible work is happening in infrastructure and in green building, but that doesn't mean they necessarily are understanding or making enough connection with those that are working in healthcare to understand the needs of the healthcare system and really start working together and how we can push both of these goals forward to be able to build the building that you are sitting in, Dr. Duhaime, as sustainably as possible, with the goals in mind of that healthcare professional to hit global health and well-being. There's got to be more conversation around it. And it's starting to happen, but it's not happening fast enough.
I just want to say, in my head, because again, you two don't know each other, and but I'm Dr. Duhaime. I'm thinking of your chapter on green hospitals, but then also too, I don't know if both of you know, I used to be a birth doula. So my first business venture as an entrepreneur, I had a company, or my business was called Vert, which means green in French. And then when I became a doula, I started to call myself the green doula. So, Doctor, when I was reading your book about the green hospital, and for audiences as a preview, is this chapter about a children's hospital and being green. It just took me back to my studies as an interior designer, focusing on sustainability. But then when I became a doula, it was like the similar path, but just how the fact that the two of you never met, and Michelle, hearing you talking about the hospital, there's just that synergy, which I think is just fabulous. And that this models how, by creating opportunities for people from different perceived silos or walks of life, once you create some type of communication bridge, there are synergies that will appear. And so with that point raised, in terms of this kind of a brainstorm, pun intended, with the neuroscience. I'm trying not to laugh so loud because I laugh at cheesy jokes and puns, and I thought that was funny. But in terms of opportunities to what are ways to kind of incentivize the reaching out of hands? Because as you speak of in your book, Dr. Duhaime, about the gamification and the reward aspect, it's what's in it for people. And it's not just so as adults, it's it's credentials, but it's just what are like, do companies, like, what if companies gave bonuses to people who could like do XYZ? I mean, I don't know the answer, hence the brainstorm, but if we can, like, can you both speak to what are ways to encourage us, older folks, older than teenagers, so that's a wide spectrum of what's in it for me? Like, how do we work with what's we know from the neuroscience with the fact that we, even though we have 7 years, we really got like 5 years, because it's like we need like a year to like be like, okay, what are we gonna do? Implement the plan, and then like at least like a year for testing. Hence, that's 7 years. So, how do we get people to be like, go?
Well, I think that's the crux of the issue, isn't it? And I'm sure Michelle has had similar experiences. The Green Children's Hospital project was an attempt to align the rewards of decision makers at the leadership of an institution, a healthcare institution, to do something dramatically pro-environmental, not because of the environmental side of it. And that's because studies have shown that environment in and of itself, for people who have other core missions, just knowing about it is insufficient to change behavior in most cases. And so it was an attempt to align the project with other things that we thought historically the leadership would find rewarding. So one was cost savings. One was improved health. We're a healthcare facility. One was, public relations, looking good to the community. And another was, the idea of being first, being innovators, being the best at something. These are things that leadership of a healthcare facility tend to find rewarding. The problems are ones that I know Michelle is familiar with, and I'm sure you are too, Day, which is the time scale. So it's easy to be innovative when the payoff of that innovation is in the short term rather than the long term. It's easier to be rewarded for taking care of the patient in front of you. This is why people go into healthcare, just like you did as a doula. It's very satisfying to help one patient at a time and get that immediate reward that you helped that patient, that family through something. It's harder to be rewarded for what you perceive as theoretic benefit to people on the other side of the world in the future. That's a harder cognitive leap for us. It's difficult. People call that discounting in time and geography. So public health is great. It's part of our mission, but public health that's global, because we decrease our carbon footprint in our facility, that's a harder leap for people to sell to your board of trustees who are making financial decisions. Being innovative, being the world's first totally carbon neutral and even carbon producing healthcare facility for children, being the first at that, that's great. But they're already almost first at multiple biomedical advances that they're already working on. That's enough first for them than going into a totally different sphere, even though they already have saved a lot of money on their facilities because they've gotten more energy efficient. But investing in this, particularly as a renovation, even though it aligns with the city and the state goals, really what they needed was a big donor. And finding a big donor who would do this as a cause, as a novel thing to invest in, well, those same big donors could donate to curing cancer. So making environmental priorities for a healthcare facility at the top of the list is just a stretch right now. It's still a stretch. They'll do it and they'll be proud of it when it aligns with their other goals. But as a new independent goal, when they already have a lot of goals that check their boxes to make strides in health, was a difficult thing. So the Green Children's Hospital, as of now, has not been built. It has not been a focus of campaigns for donors. It's not off the books. Some other hospital in some other part of the world will latch on to these ideas of a beautiful biophilic, filled with nature, high tech, living laboratory for highly energy consuming enterprises like hospitals, it may appeal to somebody else in another part of the world more than it has appealed to tip the behavioral scale quite yet where I am.
Michelle, can you respond to that?
It's hard. It's hard. The attention that we're starting to get at the world stage on these issues, we have to look at this from such a multifaceted approach, because you're right, Dr. Duhaime, it just doesn't, it doesn't always, the environment especially alone, unfortunately, does not always tip those scales to make something worthwhile. I love hearing about your work and about this specific chapter, because it's something that is being fought for across the world. And, at the end of the day, I am grateful for things as messy as it can sometimes be, when we start to get conversations around things like the SEC, ESG, requirements that are coming, or the work that's happening in the EU around the economics of this work. The conversations, whether people feel that enough is coming out of the COPs that happen every year, those conferences of the parties that happen from the UN, whether they feel that the world leaders are doing enough or not, at the end of the day, they're getting more attention than they've ever gotten before. So clearly, whether we're moving at the speed that we need to be moving or not, things are happening, and the what is a norm is shifting for the better. And we're starting to get some good news coming out as well, which will help make this incentive a little bit more palatable, as well as we're starting to see some progress and can start to show the data of what's happening. For example, the ozone layer, the studies that have just been released, that the ozone layer is healing, and the work that we've done since the 1980s on that is working. Like the science is there. That's going to start to tip some scales, but we just have to get to the point where we have that critical mass of understanding and come back to education around the importance on that triple bottom line, not just the environment, but really looking at the full picture of the people, the planet, and that prosperity side, the profit side. When we start looking at the whole pictures, then we can start to inch forward and gain even more momentum. But I think the flip side of that being first piece in that Green Hospital example, it's sometimes hard to make the commitment to be the first, but you never want to be the last either. And at the end of the day, as we start to continue to get this momentum, whether it's the speed we all know it needs to be or not, they're not going to ever want to be the ones that stayed in that old building that was polluting the environment and was causing so much problem and wasn't serving the patients at the end of the day, economically wasn't feasible. That corporation is never going to want to come out with that PR that they're the ones polluting the environment, while their competition across the globe or next door is coming out, whether they're first or not, they're coming out on top from their ESG perspective as far as what they're doing. So that is where you start to get that momentum. That whole acronym about the tide rises all boats. Eventually, if we keep working on it and keep inching that tide up, everybody is going to get on board. It just may not be that everyone's ready to be the first in that to make that jump.
I totally agree, Michelle. And the analogy that comes into my head based on the imagery day that you gave us about these silos is, we need all size of hammers. We need pickaxes. We need little ball peen hammers. Like, we need all sizes. And even in my own institution, while I haven't gotten the Green Children's Hospital initiated yet as more than a concept, my institution has continued to make gains in terms of the importance of sustainability in its operations, and supply chain, and waste management, and anesthetic gases, and having a structure, which is the Center for the Environment and Health, that they didn't have before because of these efforts from all sides. So I totally agree with you that breaking down silos is not a one solution mechanism. It's multiple people at multiple levels, and more people getting the facts, but also getting the incentives, getting the rewards in alignment, and getting, frankly, afraid, which is a motivator. Mm-hmm. So I think that we have to continue no matter what your job is, no matter what your role is, no matter how many levels you function at, and how many scales you function at in your work world, in your community, in your family, in your profession. All of these scales are important. And the more we do at each of those, in each of those spheres, the more we will chip away with whatever hammer we have in our hand through those silo walls.
That's great. So I want to ask one last question to you both. You may need to take a moment, because this question just came to mind in the last couple of minutes as I was listening to you both. So the notion of communication building and collaboration, there's a level of empathy and compassion in it, of being able to connect with each other, if you will. And so as a question, I'm going to ask if you can both, given what you both heard and learned from each other in this introduction conversation, if you were to, as professionals, for a day, it's like Freaky Friday. What's that movie? With Jamie Lee Curtis, and she's switches body with a 13-year-old or something like that. That concept, if you could switch, if you were put in each other's roles for a day, and you had the knowledge of each other in that role. So Michelle, if you were the pediatric surgeon in neuroscience, after this conversation, and if you heard what would be your kind of priorities in the next 7 years, and this what ideas may come to mind, and between 2023 and 2030 as a neuroscience, what would you like to see happen, and vice versa? And does that make sense, what I'm randomly asking you to think outside of the box in response to that outside of the box question?
So first of all, my sister is a physician, and I have unbelievable amounts of respect. And the fact that you're tackling both, Dr. Duhaime, both the climate crisis and the pediatric of all surgery, I do not wish to be in your shoes. That's incredible. And I just cannot thank you enough for the impact that you're making in bringing these two sectors together. If I were in those shoes, specifically in looking, I'm going to take this specifically from the approach of the Green Hospital experiment, because that is something I could see, what directions, what else could you do? I would look for breaking down some silos across the profession, outside of maybe that specific hospital system, to understand what has been done, what has been suggested, create as much collaboration and connection as possible in other professions that can help you build that case. So looking at, biophilia, for example, I know you mentioned biophilic design, working directly with the International Living Building Institute. How can they, what case studies do they have? What great examples do they have? Who can they connect you with in the hospital system, maybe on the other side of the world, that has done even an ounce of what you're looking at from one direction that possibly could help build that case? I'd also look at, okay, let's bring in the experts from the green building field and really discuss, some of the cutting edge academic research out there on some of these technologies. Maybe that technology that you are pushing forward does not make financial sense, but maybe they haven't yet announced or are working on some research on something that could be way more cost effective, but could at least 75% hit the goals of what you were trying to hit. So that's where my head goes, is building breaking down the barriers of the specific profession and that specific system, and looking at who can we learn from, who can we connect with that can help us build this case, because at the end of the day, we all are going to benefit, especially that local community, and especially those kids that happen to be patients at that hospital, by the creation and the fruition of the work that you've already started. And then I can't even fathom the ripple effect that would occur when this hospital is built, and suddenly it can start getting replicated across not only the country, but then how can small pieces of what you've done move into areas in the global south and bring some of that technology down there? And how can we figure out how to replicate that? So that's where my focus would go, is how can we build the case together as a world that this is critical and necessary, and then B, continue that ripple effect once we are able to use this and bring this to fruition.
Thanks, Michelle. I mean, that's exactly what we've tried to do, but we could do it more. And, you know, the problem that we have is, number one, rather than build a new hospital, what we believe we should do is renovate, because in the city of Boston alone, there are 60 to 80,000 older buildings that need to be brought up to code. You talk about the deadlines, you know, for our city and state goals for climate change. We need to figure out, how do you retrofit, and how do you do it in a cost-effective way? Because no one's going to tear down all these old buildings. So we're an old hospital. We were founded in 1811, and not all our buildings are that old. But even the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, it would be very interested in making this a demonstration project. How could we do it? How could we partner with people like the Institute, you know, the International Living Futures Institute? We have had green building architects come and talk to us about biophilic design and green design. We've reached out to these communities. What we need is an investor, and that's our stumbling block. We need somebody who thinks this is an interesting idea, who has the resources and says, I want to invest in this because this technology that you develop here can be spread all over the world and needs to be spread all over the world. And this idea of better indoor air quality and better healing environments through nature, this needs to be replicated. So that's our stumbling block now. But let me reverse, if I can, Day, and say what I would do if I were in Michelle's shoes. I think you're doing a great job, so I have really very little to offer. But what I would say is that I think it's sometimes helpful for us to understand how the brain works and how we make decisions as a species, how much variability there is from one to the other of us, and that sometimes when we find people who disagree and who don't have that perspective, we learn the most. And this I've learned from science. You come from the educational world, I come from the science world. There's something in the science world called the null hypothesis, and that is, when you're doing an experiment, you always have to consider, what if this doesn't work? What does that teach me? And in the realm of gathering data from other people, gathering input from other people, when people disagree, that's when you learn the most. And so when people push back about, gee, why should sustainability professionals tell me what to do? Their perspective, the pushback perspective, is where you learn the most. What is it about their perspective that tells you how their experience has shaped that opinion? Because in order to get around those barriers, you need to understand, and I'm sure you do this already, where they're coming from. Where are their rewards? How are their incentives aligned? Because only by understanding that can you overcome and align new incentives with the ones that they're using now. That's what the neuroscience perspective brings. And that's how the brain works. It makes its decisions based on millions of events happening at any one time. And I would just keep doing what you're doing and recognize that when you hit hurdles with non-like-minded people, they have their reasons. And if you understand their reasons, you can better align the new reasons that they need to substitute.
I absolutely mirror that. Thank you for bringing the behavior science and the neuroscience of all of it to the forefront, because at the end of the day, we are working within the confines of what our human experience is, and being able to understand the science of why we do what we do can only help to amplify our impact and our ability to be successful. So thank you for writing this incredible book and bringing this information to this conversation. It will definitely shape how I look at my work, and I appreciate that.
This is thank you both for this conversation, and thank you to all who are listening, reading, watching. Yeah, so stay tuned for other episodes of Silo Solving, and chime in with your comments on various platforms and ask questions, connect. In the show notes, I'll put a list like the book, and any investors out there, listen and reach out. Feel free. Please do. But thank you all again so much for participating in this episode of Silo Solving.